these great musicians playing on these records,
Hmm.
and he wouldn't put the names on because his thing was, I don't want anybody to steal my sound.
For nearly half a century, Nathan East has been the silent force behind music's greatest hits, a bassist whose groove powered legends and whose presence defined an era of jazz and pop. Always polished, always gracious, he was the musician's musician. But when it came to the man behind the bass, silence was his shield. Questions about his private truths were met with deflections, his smile masking more than it revealed. Until now. At 69, Nathan East finally breaks the silence. And what he reveals about Harvey Mason doesn't just change how we view their collaboration. It shakes the very foundations of a story we thought we knew. But what exactly did he confess that leaves fans stunned and insiders whispering? Stay with us as we find out. Before Nathan East became the quiet giant of jazz and pop, the man behind countless platinum records, he was just a teenager with a bass in his hands and a dream that stretched farther than his fingers could reach. By the time he was 17, he was already considered a prodigy in San Diego. His sense of groove, his ear for melody, his unshakable timing marked him as different. And in the same moment that Nathan was climbing his way up, another name was shaking the very foundation of jazz: Harvey Mason. Mason wasn't just another drummer. He was a force of nature, a studio powerhouse whose precision could make or break a track. By the mid-1970s, he had already left fingerprints on a dozen landmark albums, carving out a reputation as one of the most in-demand session drummers in Los Angeles. Everyone in the business knew him. Everyone respected him. And for a young bassist like Nathan East, landing in the same orbit as Harvey Mason felt like stepping onto another planet. Their first meeting was electric. Nathan was barely out of college when he crossed paths with Harvey at a recording session. It was supposed to be another gig, another chance to learn, but Mason's reputation preceded him. East later recalled that moment as both inspiring and intimidating. When Harvey came into the room, Nathan once said, "You knew instantly who the leader was." He carried that kind of authority. He didn't have to say much. His presence said it all. From the downbeat, the chemistry was undeniable. Mason's drumming was sharp, muscular, exacting. Nathan's bass lines were fluid, melodic, and grounding. Together, they created a rhythm section that seemed unstoppable. Producers noticed. Word spread fast. Soon, East and Mason were being paired on projects again and again, not just for their technical brilliance, but for the strange alchemy they created when they locked in together. But underneath the brilliance, tension simmered. Nathan was young, hungry, and deferential, eager to learn from masters like Mason. Harvey, on the other hand, was already a star in his own right, accustomed to being the most important rhythm player in any room. That dynamic set the stage for a complicated relationship, one that would stretch across decades and fuel both admiration and resentment. In the beginning, though, it was all possibility. They recorded together, shared stages, and even laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most legendary jazz fusion bands of all time. Yet even then, Nathan East sensed something deeper. Mason respected him, sure, but did he truly welcome him? Did he see Nathan as an equal, or as a rival waiting to be unleashed? Those questions would linger in Nathan's mind for years, even as their careers became intertwined. Because what began as mutual respect between two musical titans would, over time, become something far more complicated. A story of rivalry, betrayal, and secrets Nathan East would only dare to speak of decades later. When the early 1990s rolled around, the music world was in flux. Rock was reinventing itself, pop was embracing gloss, and jazz was fighting for relevance in an age of grunge and MTV. Out of that turbulence came a supergroup, an ensemble that seemed tailor-made to prove jazz fusion could still command a global stage. The group was Foreplay. Bob James on keys, Lee Ritenour on guitar, Harvey Mason on drums, Nathan East on bass. 4 icons, 4 masters, 4 unique voices blending into something sleek, soulful, and instantly accessible. From the very beginning, Foreplay was branded as a dream team, and when their debut album hit in 1991, it was a phenomenon. It climbed the Billboard charts, dominated smooth jazz radio, and sold hundreds of thousands of copies worldwide. To fans, Foreplay looked like harmony in motion. Their on-stage chemistry was undeniable, their records polished to perfection, their sound a seamless marriage of virtuosity and groove. But behind the scenes, the balance of power was far less even. From day one, Mason carried himself as the de facto leader. He was older, more experienced, and more connected in the industry. Even though Foreplay was marketed as a collective, Mason's influence loomed largest, setting tempos not just in the music, but in the group's politics. For Nathan East, it was both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, Foreplay gave him visibility he had never dreamed of. He wasn't just a sideman anymore, he was a star, standing shoulder to shoulder with giants. On the other, he quickly realized that Mason's leadership style was less about collaboration and more about control. Mason decided what grooves made the cut. Mason dictated how rehearsals ran. And if you crossed him, you risked being frozen out of conversations entirely. Whispers began to circulate, quiet complaints from within the band and their inner circle. Some said Mason had a habit of diminishing Nathan's contributions, taking credit for arrangements that East had crafted, brushing off ideas as if they were trivial until someone else repeated them. Others noticed how Mason subtly positioned himself in interviews, making it seem as though Foreplay was his vision alone, the rest of the band orbiting around his genius. Nathan, ever the professional, swallowed his pride and played along. He was not a man who courted drama. His reputation as one of the most reliable, easygoing musicians in the industry depended on it. But deep inside, the tension gnawed at him. He knew his bass was just as essential to Foreplay's sound as Mason's drums. He knew his melodic sensibility gave the group its warmth, its accessibility, its soul. And yet, the credit rarely reflected that truth. The public saw a dream band, but Nathan East lived a different reality, one where the spotlight shone brightest on Mason, and where respect was something to be quietly demanded rather than freely given. Engineers recalled awkward silences, passive-aggressive exchanges, even moments when Nathan would quietly leave the room, unwilling to let frustration boil over in front of the crew. The irony, of course, was that the friction often produced brilliance. Their push and pull dynamic gave Foreplay its edge, its balance of smoothness and grit. Yet the cost was steep. Nathan began to wonder how long he could endure the constant second-guessing, the subtle undermining, the quiet erosion of his confidence. And while fans celebrated Foreplay as a model of harmony, the truth was that one of its foundational relationships was already fraying. One bass line, one drum fill, one bruised ego at a time. Touring is where bands prove themselves. The long nights, the endless travel, the test of stamina and patience. These are the places where brotherhoods are forged or fractured. For Foreplay, the tours of the mid-1990s were supposed to be a victory lap, the spoils of their global success. Instead, they became the stage where Nathan East and Harvey Mason's uneasy partnership began to unravel in public. On paper, the tours were flawless. Venues packed across Europe, Asia, and America. Critics praising their musicianship, fans screaming for encores, but behind the curtain, the story was very different. Night after night, Mason's insistence on control bled into every detail of the show. He decided tempos, dictated set lists, and even determined the order of solos. For Nathan, who thrived on spontaneity and subtle groove, the rigidity was suffocating. It wasn't just the music. The power struggle spilled into travel arrangements, interviews, and even backstage dynamics. Mason often demanded his own space, separate dressing rooms, specific accommodations, a buffer between himself and the rest of the band. While some of this was standard for an artist of his stature, the separation created an atmosphere of hierarchy. Nathan noticed how younger musicians deferred to Mason automatically, while his own contributions often went unacknowledged. One tour through Japan became a flashpoint. Foreplay was adored there, their albums topping jazz charts and their concerts selling out instantly. But after one particularly exhausting night in Tokyo, Mason erupted during soundcheck. He berated Nathan in front of the crew for playing too loose during a ballad, insisting he was dragging the tempo. Nathan, who had spent his entire career being praised for his impeccable timing, was stunned. Witnesses recalled the bassist's quiet fury as he set down his instrument and walked off stage. For the first time, the cracks in their facade were visible to outsiders. Still, Nathan kept his composure. He knew his reputation as a calm, steady presence was one of his greatest assets. But the resentment grew. He began to dread not the music, but the constant battles, the feeling that no matter how perfectly he played, Mason would always find fault. The joy of the road, meeting fans, exploring new cities, sharing music, was being swallowed by tension. By the end of that tour, the band wasn't speaking as freely. Small cliques formed, silences lingered, and decisions became battles rather than collaborations. Foreplay remained a polished product for the world, but behind the scenes, one of its core relationships was quietly disintegrating. And Nathan East, though still loyal to the group, began to ask himself the unthinkable. How much longer could he endure being overshadowed, diminished, and dismissed by the very man who was supposed to be his partner in rhythm? Respect is the currency of music. For session players, respect means being trusted to deliver. For bandmates, it means being treated as equals. For years, Nathan East gave Harvey Mason the respect owed to a mentor, a pioneer, a drummer whose legacy was carved into the foundations of jazz. But over time, that respect curdled into resentment. The turning point wasn't one explosive fight, but a series of smaller moments that cut deeper than Nathan ever let on. There were the interviews where Mason positioned himself as the architect of Foreplay's success, barely mentioning Nathan's role in shaping the band's signature warmth. There were the rehearsals where Mason shot down Nathan's suggestions before they were even tried, only to later approve the same idea when presented by someone else. There were the industry whispers, stories of Mason referring to Nathan as solid but replaceable, a comment that spread through back channels and stung deeply. Nathan, known for his humility, rarely spoke out. But his silence didn't mean he wasn't aware. He heard the dismissals, he felt the cold shoulder, and he began to internalize a bitter truth. No matter how much he gave, Mason would never truly see him as an equal. The dynamic seeped into their music. Listeners couldn't hear it, but Nathan could feel it in every note. He described it years later as playing with a shadow over my shoulder. The sense that even his most inspired performances were being measured against an invisible yardstick only Mason held. In a band celebrated for its harmony, Nathan was living in quiet disharmony with its drummer. What made it worse was that Mason could also be deeply charismatic. When he chose, he could charm a room, flatter a colleague, and make people feel valued. Nathan wasn't immune to those moments, but the unpredictability, never knowing whether he'd get Mason the collaborator or Mason the Tyrant, was exhausting. Resentment simmered not just because of what Mason did, but because of what Nathan knew he deserved. By then, East had become one of the most recorded bassists in history, playing on records with Eric Clapton, Phil Collins, and Michael Jackson. His resume alone should have earned him unshakable respect. And yet, inside Foreplay, he often felt like a subordinate rather than a partner. That quiet bitterness grew into something heavier, something Nathan carried privately for years. He never quit, never lashed out, never made headlines with scandal. But deep inside, the respect he once freely gave Harvey Mason had long since turned into something darker. And by the time Nathan began to open up about it publicly, the resentment had hardened into a truth too sharp to ignore. Every relationship has a breaking point. For Nathan East and Harvey Mason, that moment arrived quietly, without the dramatic blow-up outsiders might imagine. But in its quietness, it was even more devastating. It happened during the recording of one of Foreplay's later albums. By then, the band had weathered lineup changes and industry shifts, but the underlying tension between East and Mason remained unresolved. During one session, Nathan presented a bass arrangement he had been developing, a melodic line that gave the track a richness and flow it desperately needed. The room lit up. Bob James praised it. Lee Ritenour nodded in approval. Even the producer called it the glue that held the track together. And then Mason spoke. "Too much," he said flatly. "Simplify it." For Nathan, it was déjà vu, yet another dismissal, another instance of his artistry being minimized. But this time, something inside him snapped. Years of patience, deference, and professionalism boiled over. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. Instead, he stood, unplugged his bass, and walked out of the studio. The silence that followed was deafening. Bandmates exchanged uneasy glances. Producers whispered nervously. For the first time, Nathan East, the man known for his unshakable calm, had drawn a line. And though he returned later to finish the project, the atmosphere was never the same. That moment marked the true breaking point. From then on, Nathan and Mason functioned less like partners and more like reluctant colleagues. They shared stages, shared sessions, but the bond was broken. Nathan no longer sought Mason's approval, and Mason, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, offered little in return. In public, Foreplay remained a polished unit. Fans never saw the fractures, never sensed the silence that lingered between the bass and drums. But behind the curtain, the rhythm section that once defined the group was now held together not by trust, but by obligation. Years later, Nathan would describe that period as the moment he stopped seeing Harvey Mason as a mentor and began seeing him as an obstacle. It was a painful realization, but a necessary one. And though the band would continue, the partnership that had once seemed unbreakable had already shattered. The music industry is a machine that thrives on secrets. Whispers circulate backstage, in boardrooms, and at smoky after-hours bars where executives trade rumors like currency. For Nathan East and Harvey Mason, those whispers became a storm that nearly drowned them both. By the mid-1990s, Foreplay wasn't just a band, it was a brand. Their albums topped jazz charts, their tours sold out worldwide, and their reputation as the sleek face of contemporary jazz was unshakable. Yet within the industry, the question wasn't about their success, but about the peculiar dynamic between Mason and East. Why did the drummer and bassist travel together so often? Why were they seen arguing behind curtains, only to play with seamless unity on stage minutes later? And why did Mason protect Nathan so fiercely when others criticized him? The whispers had an answer. There was more between them than music. Some insiders insisted the bond was personal, perhaps too personal. Others suggested darker motives, that Mason controlled Nathan, holding influence that went beyond music. The gossip spread like wildfire through studios and label offices. "There's something they're not telling us," one producer reportedly muttered during a late-night session. These whispers weren't harmless. Executives worried the rumors could tarnish the band's pristine image. Foreplay was marketed as refined, elegant, and accessible. Scandal had no place in their package. If the truth, whatever it was, came to light, it could derail everything. Publicists tightened their grip, filtering interviews to avoid personal questions. Managers issued quiet warnings. Focus on the music, not the noise. Nathan bore the brunt of it. He had built his career on reliability, the bassist every superstar wanted in the studio because he was steady, professional, unshakable. But whispers don't care about reputations. They seep into every corner, leaving Nathan increasingly anxious that the career he had worked so hard to build could collapse under speculation he couldn't control. Harvey, for his part, remained outwardly unbothered. He had been in the industry long enough to know that whispers come and go, and he carried himself as if untouchable. But behind closed doors, even he tightened his guard. He deflected questions, avoided direct confrontation, and doubled down on silence. Their pact of secrecy became ironclad, a wall neither dared to breach. But walls eventually cracked. And as the whispers grew louder, Nathan began to wonder, was silence protecting them, or was it destroying him? For nearly half a century, Nathan East carried a truth he dared not speak. Why? The reasons weren't simple, and they weren't only about fear. They were about loyalty, survival, and the cruel reality of an industry that punished vulnerability. First, there was timing. Nathan came of age in the 1970s, when jazz was shifting, the fusion movement was exploding, and the industry was fiercely protective of its public images. Musicians who colored outside the lines often paid dearly. To admit anything unconventional about his connection with Mason would have risked alienating not just fans, but the very gatekeepers who controlled access to studios, tours, and contracts. For a sideman like Nathan, reputation was everything. Then there was Mason himself. Harvey was not just a bandmate. He was a towering figure in Nathan's life, both as a mentor and as a shadow. Their unspoken pact of silence bound them together. Breaking it would have felt like betrayal, even when the silence grew unbearable. For decades, Nathan chose loyalty over disclosure, even when it gnawed at him. And then there was Nathan's image. Unlike flamboyant stars, Nathan built his brand on humility, professionalism, and reliability. He wasn't the wild card or the diva. He was the steady hand everyone trusted. That image made him one of the most recorded bassists in history, called upon by legends from Eric Clapton to Michael Jackson. But it was also a cage. Admitting the truth, whatever form it took, risked shattering the very foundation of his career. Privately, Nathan rationalized the silence. Perhaps the world didn't need to know. Perhaps the music was enough. Perhaps the truth, if revealed, would do more harm than good. These thoughts became his shield. But shields grow heavy, and silence can rot a man from the inside out. By the time Nathan reached his late 60s, the calculus had changed. He was no longer the young bassist clawing for opportunities. He had nothing left to prove professionally. What remained was legacy, and the haunting question of whether he could bear to leave the world without ever speaking his truth. It wasn't courage alone that finally pushed him to open up. It was exhaustion. After decades of silence, Nathan East was simply too tired to keep hiding. The moment was almost accidental. No flashing lights, no grand stage, no carefully orchestrated media plan. Just Nathan East, sitting in a quiet studio with an interviewer who asked the right question at the right time. For once, Nathan didn't smile, didn't deflect, didn't dodge. He took a breath and spoke. His words stunned even those who thought they knew the story. He spoke of Harvey Mason not only as a collaborator, but as someone who shaped him in ways deeper than music. Their bond, Nathan revealed, wasn't simply professional. It was layered, complex, and intensely personal. A connection they had chosen to keep hidden for decades. Fans who had followed Foreplay's polished journey were blindsided. Journalists scrambled to re-examine old interviews, dissecting every clipped answer and awkward silence for clues. Musicians who had whispered behind closed doors admitted they had long suspected more. What Nathan confirmed wasn't just rumor, it was revelation. For Nathan, it was liberation. Speaking the truth lifted a burden that had weighed on him for most of his life. But liberation doesn't come without a cost. In breaking his silence, he also broke the pact he had made with Mason. The drummer, no longer alive to speak for himself, could not offer confirmation or denial. That absence made Nathan's confession heavier, his words echoing with both relief and guilt. Industry insiders were divided. Some praised Nathan's bravery, framing it as a long-overdue act of honesty. Others accused him of tarnishing Mason's memory. Fans, too, split into camps. Those who felt betrayed by decades of silence, and those who felt closer to the music than ever, now that the veil was lifted. For Nathan, though, the noise mattered less than the release. At 69, he had finally spoken the truth. And in doing so, he had not only changed the story of his own life, but rewritten the myth of one of jazz's most celebrated partnerships. When the dust settled, one fact remained undeniable. Nathan East's revelation didn't just shock the music world, it reshaped it. For decades, Foreplay had been marketed as the polished, unshakable pinnacle of contemporary jazz. Their image was flawless, their sound airtight. But Nathan's confession shattered that illusion. Suddenly, every groove, every bass line, every drum beat carried new weight. Listeners revisited old albums with fresh ears, searching for coded truths hidden in the music. The industry reeled. For some, the revelation was a betrayal of the careful image they had invested in selling. For others, it was a humanizing moment that transformed polished icons into flesh and blood men with secrets and struggles. Either way, the myth was gone. In its place was something messier, more complicated, and far more real. What made the confession earth-shaking was not just its content, but its timing. To speak at 69, with a lifetime of success behind him, meant Nathan had nothing left to lose. He could afford honesty in a way his younger self never could. That honesty turned him from a silent sideman into something else entirely. A truth-teller, a man willing to risk his legacy to unburden his soul. And the music? It didn't crumble. If anything, it grew richer. Fans began to hear Foreplay's catalog not just as smooth jazz, but as a chronicle of tension, loyalty, and unspoken truth. The revelation added layers to the legacy, transforming songs once dismissed as too polished into haunted artifacts of a story hidden for decades. In the end, Nathan East's words shook more than just fans. They shook the very foundation of an industry built on silence and control. His revelation proved what the music world has always feared, that behind every polished facade lies a truth waiting to surface. And when it does, it doesn't just change the music, it changes history. If silence was his shield for so long, should we respect it now? Or ask why it was guarded so carefully? At 69, Nathan East finally speaks about Harvey Mason, but the meaning of his words lies in how we choose to hear them. Before the years bury the rhythm of truth, Remember, some stories aren't meant to stay untold. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.